So tonight we've got a really fun discussion on Paul's description of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Unfortunately, we didn't have the second half of 15, which has some fun analogies of like a seed and some other stuff. But we'll get to that. I got you covered, don't worry. So we're going to go through a little bit and see kind of what Paul is trying to express to us about what all this means. It's easy for us to say, for example, in the Nicene Creed, we believe in the resurrection of the body, but what does that actually mean? And Paul has some actually, I think, pretty helpful, and in some ways obvious, in some ways maybe not so obvious implications for what that means. When we say that we believe in the resurrection, what does that mean? So, to start off, Stott highlighted Christ as victor. This is the first funny picture of the night. Not as funny, but he conveys that Paul is really trying to highlight Jesus as a victor over something. That's the obvious implication, that there's a victory over something specific, which is, of course, death, right? So in chapter 15, he has three sort of main points that he works through. The first little section, he recounts what is the central focus of the gospel teaching, Jesus' salvation, and he kind of goes through a little bit of the history of that. The majority of what we talked about tonight, I think, or in the discussions, was this middle section of sort of the logical arguments for or against of, if you do deny the resurrection of the body, then that means you're denying Christ. And then if you're denying Christ and resurrection, then what's the point, right? That's the basic logical premise, if you will. The syllogism, if this, then that, and so on. If that makes sense. And last bit, he dives into what sort of resurrection will this be? As in, do you get to keep the same color of your eyes or the same hair color? Some of those questions are kind of spoken to. And he has some interesting things to say, and so does the rest of the church over the last 2,000 years. We're not going to recap because that's a lot to go through, and there's not enough time. But, so, I'm sorry, I already said this, but this is the basic premise of what we're trying to convey of Christ's victory over death and what that means ultimately for us. So, a question, why does Paul care so much about this whole matter in the first place? So to start, he's not the first person to spend a lengthy amount of time talking about it. If you look for even just a little bit in the Gospels or anywhere in the New Testament, I guarantee you're going to find at least somebody referencing something about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I can guarantee it. If you look in the book of Acts, every time they turn around, Paul or Peter or Barnabas or somebody is getting harassed, and they're confident in preaching Christ crucified, that he really died and he really rose again. This happens all over the place, so that should tell us something, that it is important, that it is significant. And if you tally up just in Paul's own epistles, there's at least 80 references to something to do with Christ's death and Christ mentioned his resurrection. That's just in Paul's writing, not counting the other epistles, and there's a whole bunch more. So this is a very common theme, and so obviously it should bear some discussion or contemplation. When he references, this is just a fun little note about one of Christ's first appearances to Simon Peter, or in one place in Luke he says Cephas. That's the Aramaic name. In Greek, it's Simon Peter. So, this happens throughout Christ's resurrection appearances. These are, this is just to further impress the significance of Christ as a real person, really appeared in physical form to other people. And we have lots of witnesses of that in the Gospels, and then references to those moments in some of Paul's letters, primarily in 15, that he references many of these. So again, if you're wondering, why are we talking about this? Well, we're talking about it because this is what the first apostles and disciples did too. Because there's a fundamental new understanding of what resurrection actually is, and a new conception of what resurrection can be. Because as if you've heard of just a little bit of the Jewish understanding of what Sheol is, and we know that the Jews sort of progressed in their own understanding, which is where we get to next, of what Jesus did too. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Another reason why Paul cares so much is because Jesus himself did that. He predicts his own death several times in his own earthly ministry. That should clue us into something, of that this is an important and monumental moment in the life of God's plan for salvation for the world. And these are just a few instances of that from John. In John's Gospels, they're a little bit more subtle. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're very direct and very explicit in describing, and on the third day I will rise again. And so these are just some instances of Christ doing that too. Okay, back to Sheol. So there's an interesting understanding of what happens after you die. As you could imagine, people for thousands of years have wondered and asked the question, what happens when we die? A natural question for anyone to ask. So the Jews have this understanding very early on of Sheol. We have references to this throughout the Old Testament. And the basic understanding at first is that it's some sort of departure, and that there's a clear separation from God and from the living people, and that when you die, you're somewhere else, this grave, if you will, and that gets called Sheol. But we know that this belief system sort of changes, and this is totally natural and understandable that their understanding would change. And if you look for just a minute in a couple really cool places in the Old Testament, we have some, I would think, pretty obvious reasons for that understanding to change. So these are just a couple of excerpts. So first from Deuteronomy, saying, I kill and I will make alive. That's a direct reference to something that we understand too. The prophets go through all this all the time. There's several really great instances from Isaiah that I didn't put in, but they're great to see. This is from Samuel. Yahweh kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and brings up. So this is a nice little twofer. One, this is kind of building off of Deuteronomy, recognizing that death happens, but then also life happens after that too. But the second phrase should sound familiar to one of the images that we have in and around Easter. That there's this idea. There's all sorts of beautiful paintings that describe and depict what sometimes is called the Harrowing of Hell. That when Christ dies on Good Friday, that there's a little bit of time before he rises again. So there's this concept called the Harrowing of Hell, where he breaks through the gates of hell, and it's really epic and pretty impressive. That would have been a good picture to have. Sorry, that's for next time. But there's the idea that Christ himself goes down physically to raise all the people that have been waiting. And I think this is a really nice foreshadowing of that concept. In Job, this is a further testament of Job's own personal belief. But as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. In the end, he will stand upon earth. After my skin is destroyed, then in my flesh shall I see God. And this is kind of an interesting one, because this should sound maybe kind of familiar to this question of what happens to our bodies when we die. That the physical skin and stuff decays. Eventually the bones will decay into dust, right? But there's a greater hope that we will get to be physically with God. Hosea's prophecy is awesome. I mean, that's pretty explicit in its indication or reference to Christ's own death and resurrection. After 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will raise us up, and we will live before him. So we see this sort of development throughout the life of the Israelites and the Jews. And then when we get to Jesus' time, we have lots of different accounts with the Pharisees and Sadducees, and there's that joke of why are the Sadducees sad? Because they don't believe in the resurrection. So they're the sad Sadducees, if you will. I mean, that is a joke that some people make. Not everybody. That's okay. Thank you, Greg. You were there for me, 2 weeks ago with. Anyway, so I appreciate it.
Pumpkin patch.
The pumpkin patch. I mean, it was awesome. I'm glad you thought it was a good joke too.
That's why they say they are sad, you see.
That's right.
And then the Pharisees, because that's the law, they are not fair, you see.
They are not fair, you see. I hadn't heard the Pharisees part. I like that. So,
What was the difference in that world between the Sadducee and the Pharisee? What was
like how they came to that conclusion?
no, not their belief there, but what differentiates it? Is one a higher, like one's a bishop and one's a priest?
Well, one's
No, it's a
religion and
different
one's
sort of.
law.
It's a different group. Say again.
Well, one's more religion, like the religious, the high priest, and the other one's more law.
Oh, okay.
I believe so, but it's kind of. I think it's kind of two different sort of streams or entities. I don't think it's quite the same delineation like as a denomination or something, but they're different. I wish I was there and
One
could
was
speak
more
better.
spiritual leader, and one was more of a legalistic,
Like the law.
follow the
Making
law,
sure they-
631 laws.
Oh, all the laws. They did like it. So there's this development of belief, and then we come to Jesus' time where there is a group that identify with the law and the Pharisees that do believe in some sort of resurrection, and then there's another group that don't, that they don't think anything happens at all. Okay. And so I should back up and say that this whole concept would have still been on the minds of Corinthian Christians, if you will, of people in the city of Corinth that had heard some of what Paul and other disciples had said, and were trying to compare that with what they had grown up learning in the temple and learned before, and so they have to sort of wrestle with this new concept. Obviously, in Corinth had a great influence from Greek civilization and life. So one of that would be Greek philosophy and a guy named Plato, and this is a very, very simplistic understanding that's even above my head, but here it is. So there's a concept in Greek philosophy, this understanding between the relationship between the body and soul, and that they are somewhat separate. So Plato had this concept that the physical bodies are imperfect copies of ideal forms that exist in some other spiritual realm. And his whole thought that the bodies are mortal and that the souls existed prior to life on earth and will continue to exist beyond this life here and now. For many, and so in this concept, the earthly life was something that was more of a burden almost, in that once they did die, it was something of a good riddance. I'm glad to be done with this decrepit old body. But this is quite distinct from our Christian understanding of what the body and soul is and what our duty is to it as well. And this comes out of the Jewish understanding of this sort of wholeness of body and soul being together and wanting to be whole. As Paul describes, this is towards the end of chapter 15, he's saying, it is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, and it is raised in power. Here Paul is getting a little bit and trying to describe with some certainty of what happens when we die and what that sort of life looks like. What sort of body do we have, and is it made better in some way? The short answer is yes. And we're going to unpack that in just a minute. So one of the understandings is that after we die, the body that we are risen up with or raised with is somehow perfected and given some properties of God, of some pretty cool attributes which we're going to unpack. Okay, here's the second question. and the funny picture. How does it all work? This is a very fun seminary question that people love to talk about, and no one had a good answer of like, are we going to have, the hair that we were born with, when we were, 1 day old, or is it going to be this majestic, flowing, gray hair of this old man? I don't know. But, so, there is a great analogy, though, that I think is helpful to unpacking a little bit of what our understanding of what happens after we die. Is it the same body, or is it different, and in what way? So, he has this analogy of a seed. This is verses 36 to 38. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. That makes sense. We have to die. And what you sow is not the body that it is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. So here he has this concept of a seed that has to completely change shape to become what it's truly meant to be. And that even if you look at a tomato seed, it doesn't necessarily look like a tomato plant, but yet it does become. And I'm not sure exactly how that works, but I like the analogy, at least to me. I think it makes some sense. Okay. Paul's also speaking in direct response to what was a common question or some doubt of how does this work, why does this happen, and we see reference to this in some other segments of the New Testament. So these are just two other instances. First, from 2 Timothy, among them Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have departed from the truth. They say that the resurrection has already taken place, and they destroy the faith of some. We know that is not true. This also speaks to the danger of teaching wrong, of teaching unorthodox or just not right faith. In Acts, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." Which I think is a kind of funny illustration of what this sort of dynamic might have looked like as Paul is speaking to a large group of people gathered together. And some think, oh, this makes sense. And some are like, well, this sounds really dumb. Or some say, well, maybe I want to hear you explain a little bit more. So all this is just illustrative that this is a common discussion and question for first and second and even beyond century Christianity. So one of the questions that might be on your mind is, what do we believe as Anglicans in 2021? So, two primary places where we get our belief are from the creeds that have been passed down for the last, 1,800 years, give or take 100 years. So one of which, the Nicene Creed, has the particular phrase, we believe, there's lots of we believes, and then we believe and look for the resurrection of the dead. And the Apostles' Creed says similarly, and I believe in the forgiveness of sins and the resurrection of the body. And this is coming as inspired by what Scripture has revealed, and people gathered together in these statements of faith. So we do believe in some resurrection of the dead. There's still a question of what does that really look like? And so hopefully we can find another answer. There's a distinction between the flesh and the soul. So one of the questions people asked or have asked is, do both need to be raised? Do you just need the soul, or do you need just the body, or do you need one or the other? There's this idea that the soul lives on eternally and the flesh has to be sort of brought along, sort of separate along to, and then rejoined. And there's what I found particularly helpful. This came out of the Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century, which is sort of a distillation of what all the church fathers and all these old guys had said and progressed in their own thought over the last 1,500 years, and is summed up in 4 critical areas. And they're saying that the same body that we had here on earth is raised, but it has been given specific gifts. And so these are 4 different gifts, and we should recognize these as gifts that Christ himself possessed when he comes back and he spends some time on earth after his own resurrection. And this is directly where this comes from. So these 4 gifts: impassibilitas, or impassibility, that the idea that the risen body does not suffer, that the risen body doesn't like get hot or cold or get pain or sick or anything like that. That's one belief. There's the gift of claritas, or clarity, that we will shine brightly. And there's some belief that you will shine, some will shine brighter than others or shine differently. This comes out of 1 Corinthians 42 and 43, which describes different types of shining, like the sun shines in a particular way during the day, but the moon also shines, but shines differently. Not necessarily better or worse, just different. And then there's another concept of agilitas, or agility, which is just the freedom of movement with ease, which immediately, at least for me, comes to mind, the idea or the image of Christ like just passing through a doorway somehow. Pretty neat. Yes, right.
Are they saying the physical body will rise?
Yeah.
But how does that make logical sense in the sense of is go and dig up a dead body?
Right,
It's still
right,
there.
right. So there's and that was certainly one of the Roman Catholic Church for a long time didn't allow their people to be cremated because they thought that messed with that. What we know over time is that the body eventually disintegrates regardless, and that cremation effectively just kind of accelerates that process. There's a concept that he explores too in the analogy of the new Adam, and he makes this comparison between the connection between the first man and Adam and Christ, and how Christ is this perfected Adam. And we're joined in that, and there's an idea, and that I'm forgetting, it has a more eloquent technical name, that just as God first made man out of dust, that our resurrection or our risen body might come from the same dust again. At least to me, I think that makes some sense. But it's a fair question that I don't fully know how it
Yeah,
works.
that dust is still always going to be there.
The dust is always going to be there.
Does our soul fall asleep?
Does our soul fall asleep? What do you mean by that?
Well, I don't, the Bible, it talks about, they just all are asleep, but then, I always just thought your soul just always was alive, and when you died, it just changed from here to there.
Sure.
But you always stayed awake, but I don't know.
Well, for me at least, so the question of do we fall asleep? Somehow the soul falls asleep or doesn't fall asleep. What does that look like? For me at least, in my primitive understanding, is that one of the challenges when discussing any of this is that we're trying to describe something that's on a completely different plane of existence, that also operates outside of our own time. So, in one way you could say that, as soon as you die, then we're already up in heaven with everybody else, and Jesus has already come and everything's already happened. Maybe. What that passage of time that does or does not exist, I don't know how that works. So there certainly is the concept, and I know what you're referring to, but it's the specific citation is forgotten. That's a better way to say it. Of people that have fallen asleep. Sometimes that's referring to people's spiritual well-being, during their time on earth, but not always. Paul.
This sounds like Christ when he was risen. But the huge difference between Christ and us when we died is that his body went with him. And our body stays here.
Right.
And that's the whole issue.
But there's some sort of rising up and we do have some sort of like tangible body. I don't know how it works, but that's
Lose an arm or.
I
Yes,
agree
Mike.
with your point that we're trying to describe this in English language with our current understanding. I think all this stuff goes beyond our understanding. I look at some of these though, and I don't think they're arbitrary. I look at the fact that there are people who, before they died, suffered greatly.
Yeah.
So to them, the fact that there would be no suffering is important. There are people who've been subverted or pushed into corners of society and never get paid attention to. And so to them, they'll shine brightly. They'll be important. There are people that were maybe stuck in a wheelchair, couldn't move, paralyzed. They will have freedom of movement. I think these are to equate what human frailties are going to be relieved. I just think that's a conceptual thing.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
right. Like that's the more, I don't know, profound point of that, the person that was like wheelbound for all their life, they're not gonna be wheelbound in heaven. Like that wouldn't make sense, like at all. So what that body actually looks like and where it like comes from, I don't know. What we do know is that Christ, when he came back, he's like, you can still touch it, but yet he's still able to like walk through walls. So I don't know how any of that works, but this is, no, he did both. He did both. He did that before and
I told you my brain's
that's okay. Okay. The last point is kind of a more interesting one, I think, is that this idea that the body that we have here that is flesh and susceptible both to frailty and like wound, but is also susceptible to temptation. And that's this concept of having all these different desires and motivations of the will that are disordered, and that when we're in heaven, when we're risen, everything is rightly ordered and in following with God's like will, and that the relationship between the body and the soul, or the flesh and soul, is made perfect when we're risen. So that's the last one. That's the last one. So here's your last little funny image of when he's describing the first fruits and the whole like significance of Christ's death and resurrection starts with his incarnation. That he comes as like full flesh and blood and human form, just like all of us. And then because he died, because he rose again, and we believe that we're like united to his like body to be with God, then like that becomes sort of our entry ticket, if you will, to the resurrection. The little point some people have made, or sort of a criticism, if you will, or question about, what about, the people like Lazarus, or we just read it in Acts, there's a guy who was like listening to the sermon because Paul was talking for, the whole day, and he like fell off a window and like kind of died, and then he like brought him back again, but that was not the same as Christ's resurrection, or, new life, because Lazarus, he was just like kind of like brought back to life, or sometimes just gets described as being resuscitated. And so that's kind of a fundamental difference between, say, Elijah's straight like shot up to heaven and Christ's ascension too, if that makes sense. The last bit on first fruits that I thought was just an interesting depiction or understanding of what that really means. So obviously we have this understanding in terms of giving what we first receive. So whether it be of a bountiful harvest that you give the first bit of that. There's this idea coming from this understanding of the cycle of the year, that the first fruits are a sign of even more to come, that the good days are ahead, if you will. And when Paul says that the resurrected Christ is the first fruits of those who are asleep, it's getting back to your point about people that are asleep, he's telling that the Corinthian Christians that Christ's resurrection is just the beginning, And his resurrection signals the abundance of resurrections yet to come. The resurrection of all those who have placed their faith in Christ. I thought that was a succinct understanding of the first fruits of the resurrection. So, those are some thoughts about the resurrection. We are out of time, but we could probably take like a question before we send you home, if there's something burning, or you can talk to me after. Great, thank you. So make sure you get a lesson for next week, and then you stand and we'll have a prayer.